Evening, everybody. Hope everyone can hear me. Thank you firstly for joining me this evening or this afternoon or this morning or late night, wherever you are in the world. It's brilliant to be able to chat to you all. This was just basically an idea that I had a couple of weeks ago, bearing in mind obviously everything that's going on in the world at the moment. And my idea was to try and just spread a little bit of knowledge about the football industry more widely, and just try and explain a little bit about what I do, the industry more broadly, and I guess ultimately just try and share some of my experiences as a sports and football lawyer. So here we go. So yeah, thanks for joining me. We've already got quite a few people joining, which is fantastic. Thank you very much. Yeah, so the structure for the course basically, and this is obviously just an introduction for the moment anyway, is every day at 6 o'clock UK GMT, is to do about 15 minutes or so of a chat about a particular topic. And then after that, to try and do a Q&A, and I could already see loads of people joining, which is great, and to start speaking about particular things. That's hopefully the idea of all of this, and we'll try and have a good discussion. So 15 minutes of chat by me, 15 minutes hopefully then some questions from everybody. And the idea is really just to spread the word. We're going to try and do this for at least 2.5 weeks or so. We're going to broadcast every day until at least Tuesday, the 7th of April. And that's going to be every weekday, Monday to Friday. And if you can't make it as well, all of these sessions will be available on my channel afterwards as well, so you can watch and listen and get involved as much as you're able to. So yeah, what we're going to actually be talking about, that's one of the things that I think we want to try and cover in a little bit of detail. So you have to excuse me, I've got a little list here of all the things that we're going to be covering on a daily basis. So yeah, today is basically the introduction, where I'm more or less just going to be trying to set out the landscape or the ecosystem, more or less about how the football system works with clubs and players basically in the middle of that. Tomorrow we're going to talk about football transfers, player transfers particularly, and then talk about player contracts on Wednesday. So transfers are more or less just going to be how transfers work and how things work within the transfer agreement, and what agents get involved in and do, and the types of documentation. Player contracts is really going to be the employment contract and the image rights deal that that can usually be involved when it comes to the player side of things. Thursday, we're going to talk mainly or almost exclusively about boot deals, getting onto the commercial side of the player game. And then on Friday, we're going to talk on the more broader topic of image rights. So as you can see from that first week, the idea more or less is to try and just cover, I'm just going to try and put the screen a little bit in the middle, trying to cover player topics. That's the idea for that first week. So transfers, contracts, boot deals, image rights. And then the second week from Monday the 30th, the idea then is to be talking about agents, what they actually do. And I think from my book, hopefully one of the things that if some of you guys have read it, I try and put maybe a slightly more balanced view of agents. I think the media perception generally seems to be pretty harsh. Sometimes that can be the case, but I think there's a lot of very good agents out there. So one of my aims of the book, and maybe the sessions we're going to talk about, is to actually put across a slightly different perspective on a lot of the hard work and good stuff that agents do. Tuesday, I'm going to specifically just delve into probably the most important contract for agents, which is the representation contract, and that's the contract between the player and his agent, and what basically that entails. That can be pretty detailed. There's a standard FA contract, which is only a couple of pages long, and then there's contracts that I tend to draft, and that can be between 5 to 15 pages, depending on the complexities of things. I think one of the, and then on the next day, on the 1st of April, one of the most important and interesting elements of some of the conversations I have with people inside and outside of the industry is actually how players pay their agents, if they do pay them at all. And that's quite specific in the UK and across Europe as to the fact usually that clubs pay players' agents. And so I just want to set out on that in quite a lot of detail. There can be lots of tax and other reasons because of that as well. And then Thursday, we've got hopefully quite an interesting session on third-party investment, third-party ownership. This was a big deal back in the Tevez Mascherano days when they were playing for West Ham. And that's evolved as well a little bit over the last 6 months or so because of a particular FIFA change in their regulations. So I want to talk about the background of that and how that's impacted on the summer window to a degree and some of the things that I've seen. And then after that, what we're going to try and talk about on Friday, the 3rd of April, is social media and its impact. I think, again, one of the things I talk about in my book to a degree is, that obviously social media can have huge pitfalls for players, especially, and lots of players who get into trouble and probably will continue to get into trouble. But ultimately, the ability for social media to do endless amounts of good is usually underplayed. And I want to try and just delve into the positive of social media as well as what can also be the negative. Last two topics then for the 6th of April, Monday the 6th of April, is probably one of the most topical areas right now, if it hadn't been obviously for the coronavirus and everything that is happening at the moment, and that's probably the reason a lot of us are here, is financial fair play. It's been controversial right from the beginning of its implementation from UEFA, then lots of other different leagues implementing those, including the Premier League and the EFL as well. And there's loads of controversy going on at the moment. It was Manchester City, a number of EFL clubs as well, including I think Aston Villa, Sheffield Wednesday, and others as well have active investigations ongoing. And then what I want to try and do for then Tuesday, the 7th of April, is basically then just try and weave those first topics together. So almost that first two weeks and a couple of days is effectively a lot of the things on the player and agent side. Obviously, there's a few extra topics there as well. And then hopefully if that goes well and people are actually still half interested in listening and watching and wanting to know more, then the idea of the live chat to a degree is to try and ask what topics people are interested in, what topics people want to hear more of, more detail that people want to be able to talk about more general. Sophia, I just had a question from you as to Corona in the football industry. Completely agree. I think that's got to be a whole couple of topics in itself, and how that will impact on lots of different things. I've written a couple of blogs on that recently and posted a couple of podcasts, the Done Deal podcast as well, relatively recently as well. So I can put all the links in for that. So that's the plan for the next 2.5 weeks or so. There's going to be tons of stuff and positive that we'll be able to talk about in more detail. And there's loads of areas that I'm sure we will want to discuss in more forensic nuance as well. And I think one of the points that I want to try and stress as well is there's a whole other club side of that as well. So club takeovers, club commercial deals, all of the issues that revolve around football clubs more generally, as well as broadcasting rights, as well as the international game, etc. So that's something we're definitely going to cover if people are still interested and they want to try and get involved in some of those topics. So Hamad, I've just seen a point from you about career advice for law students and career advice more generally. Yeah, that's definitely something that I've been thinking about as well. And what I'm actually thinking about doing at some point is maybe doing a few sessions on careers in sport, getting into the industry, nuances of that, networking, how to best build knowledge, practice, and all those type of things. So yeah, I'd love to be able to I will be able to do that at some point. It's just when really. So that's the idea there. Loads of cool questions about esports, about finishing the season, vacation schemes on law firms, etc. I'm going to try and take some of the questions at the end, and then that'll be great to be able to talk through. But if I just start maybe just on a couple of bits. So I think the bit that I just want to probably cover also is just one other thing on my channel at the moment, which might be useful for people, is I did a 4-part series with the great guys at 21st Club great guy called Omar Chowdhury. We did a 4-part series talking about a number of the areas of football and football industry, and the guys at 21st Club are awesome. We talked a quite long and in-depth piece on agents, on club ownership, on how transfers work and broadcasting rights. So I'd really recommend checking those out on my channel. They're all available at the moment. I also put them on my podcast, so you can have a listen to it then. Okay, very briefly, I'm just going to try and put the volume up because it says the volume might be a little bit low. Check that we're okay. I think we are. Brief background as to me, and then I can talk about the first area of discussion. So I'm a lawyer. I'm a lawyer. I haven't always been a football and sports lawyer. I was more traditionally, back in the day, and a long time ago, relatively long time ago, a regulations and antitrust lawyer. And over the years, from doing takeover work for particular clubs, from looking at all the different regulations, from working on financial fair play and third-party investment matters, I then sort of pivoted to working more with players and agents over maybe the last 7 or 8 years or so. And usually, if I give a very brief background of the type of work that then I tend to get involved in, it's usually about a strand of maybe 4 or 5 things. And those things tend to revolve around, one is player transfers, so everything to do with a player moving from club to club. That usually then can also involve in the player employment contract, image rights deal, other types of contracts that can be involved in those type of transactions too. The other more or less second commercial area can then involve boot deals, image rights deals, endorsement deals, ambassador work for particular players and even clubs as well. And then after that, I guess you have this whole sort of compliance piece, I guess, which is one thing. And that can be compliance with agents rules, compliance with FA rules, compliance with Premier League and EFL rules, UEFA, FIFA rules, or particular rules of jurisdictions as well. And that then moves into the whole area of football disputes. And I know that isn't one of the areas that was going to be on the discussion point, but I think it would be on the course list. But that's certainly something we can go into some detail with as well. So that's the type of things that I do day to day. I also get involved in generally, reputation management stuff when things are going to be in the press, the compliance issues of usually the regulations side of the football world, where disciplinary matters might happen, where the FA or others may charge particular players with doing things wrong, bringing the game into disrepute, etc. So that's usually roundabout where my expertise, at least in football, comes along. I also do quite a lot of work in basketball and other sports more generally, and the wider sports team at Sheridan's does a huge amount of work. But that's basically me and my at least core competencies. What I want to just, if it's okay, just to maybe then spend 5 minutes on, or 5 or 10 minutes on, and then I can start going through all of the questions, is talking about the football ecosystem, basically. And in my book, and I'm actually using the diagram that's actually on my screen as well at the same time, just to talk through that. I set out quite early on the sort of football ecosystem as I see it. And the football ecosystem basically for me is all of the different actors, all of the different stakeholders, and how they effectively interlink. And for me, when I was actually trying to draft this out, it got a bit difficult because I was trying to work out then, the best way to set this out. But for me, effectively, I think the main players basically are the players and the clubs. So in a way, I always see the clubs and the players as the center of the football universe to a degree. You have the clubs in the middle employing the players. You have the players transferring effectively round a variety of different clubs across nations, internationally or otherwise. And then effectively you have this spiral effect where you have clubs employing players and managers, and obviously sacking managers and employing new players and transferring players on. You have then the contentious area of agents, where clubs are effectively paying players' agents on players' behalf. We'll talk about that in a lot of detail. So we've got a whole session on the agents' interaction in the ecosystem, but that's basically usually with clubs. Query whether the club is acting, rather whether the agent is acting for the player or the agent is acting for the club, and that's something that was a bit of a nuance to be discussed. I think the other important area, which I'd quite like to talk about in a couple of sessions as well, is the interaction between investment into football clubs. And that can be club owners, it can be minority or majority investment into football clubs, and the rationale for that. People have lots of different reasons why they'd like to own a football club, and that gets delved into it quite a bit in my book, but we can talk about that hopefully at some point. So far we've got players, managers, agents, investors, and owners generally. I think most people would consider that the next category is probably the most important, in that they are the fans. The fans effectively purchasing commercial merchandise, commercial I can't even speak at the moment, tickets for particular games. But most importantly, they are purchasing pay TV subscriptions. And that ultimately is the major point, which takes us on then to the next area, which really is broadcasting rights, and broadcasters as probably one of the major one of the most significant stakeholders in the game. You only have to look to what is going on at the moment. There's a couple of questions about Corona, obviously, and how that would impact on club season. There's no doubt that it's absolutely imperative for the players, for the clubs rather, to try and finish that season because of the TV monies that they rely on in order to be able to fund everything. The players, their wages, the transfer fees, the club as a whole, the maintenance of everything that is the football industry. And that's why it's so important that those TV subscriptions stay pretty solid. But then after that, actually, that the broadcasters are able to broadcast those live premium matches. They're still going to be available. And more importantly, after that, then the circle continues. So subscribers pay for subscriptions, broadcasters pay for the rights, clubs play the games. As long as that circle and cycle continues, the financial security of the game will be there. The query, which has obviously been one of the main significant issues over the last period of time, has very much been whether there would be an issue with some games not being able to be finished to be played because of everything Corona related. So, lots of press releases from different leagues. The Premier League has said that the league will go on indefinitely in order to finish the season. Question is now when that would possibly happen. And everybody is saying, it might be June, it might be July. The truth is, I think we are at the virus's control now is unfortunately the issue, not the other way around. So everything has obviously got to be safely handled. And I think the main priorities for everyone is to hopefully contain what is, a horrendous situation right now. And then after that has actually happened, be it if some antiviral drugs are used and can be used effectively, and then a vaccine in the long term, whether that leads to obviously a more stable economic system, which can then feed into the different industries, sport and football being one of those. So I think what I want to just talk about is that there's a few other stakeholders. If it's the international organisations like UEFA, FIFA, national federations like the FA, international teams as well, but also one of the other big areas at the moment, and always is commercial brands. All the different commercial brands that are looking to get involved in the football ecosystem, if that's with clubs, if that's with leagues, if that's with international competitions, if it's with players, if it's with managers, if it's interacting with agents in order to get deals for the talent, etc. So commercial brands as well as the TV broadcasters have a pretty important say in how football is run, and rightly so, because that is their prerogative with the amount of money that they are putting into the game. So that was basically it in terms of the ecosystem. What I was looking to try and do was show that sort of 360 approach. So if in the middle we have clubs and players, and if on the outside effectively surrounding that central core, we've got managers and players, agents, investors, fans, commercial brands, broadcasters, and then leagues and wider associations. So over the course of hopefully this course that we'll try and do over the next few weeks, but hopefully a few months if everyone wants to listen in a little bit more, we'll try and delve into all of those particular topics in a bit more detail. So that's what I was going to say there. I'm going to just go through some of the questions that have come through just as a starter, and then I can talk through some of these particular points. So we've gone through careers, ramifications for the season not finishing. This is from Sinergu. The clubs are adamant to finish the season, presumably because of TV money. It's exactly right. So at the moment, one of the major issues is trying to make sure we can finish that season. One idea that I've thought about a little bit in terms of, it's likely, I think, that the clubs are going to play possibly behind closed doors. The query is whether those closed doors will be stadia that we played in, or whether actually there would be the possibility of playing at training grounds, for example. Obviously, those games would still need to be televised, and the right type of safety restrictions would need to be put in place. But obviously, it's a lot more straightforward, subject to regulations of each particular league, to put on matches at training grounds in a much more enclosed, confined environment, rather than a big stadium where you will obviously need a certain amount of people on hand for those type of matters. So one thing to consider, yeah, absolutely right. The season needs to finish, and that's really important. Mark O'Neill talking about interest in our take on the owners and directors test as it stands. Do you think it's robust enough? Yeah, it's a really good point, and that's, I think, one of the things we're going to talk about in the club section, hopefully in a week or two's time. But the owners and directors test is basically, for everyone else, a set of objective tests in the UK for potential owners to be able to buy a club, and you have to fulfil certain criteria, like not having an unspent conviction in criminal, not having insolvency events, not being disqualified in particular organisations. So there's lots of different objective criteria which have to be passed in order to become an owner of a football club. There's unfortunately been some situations where owners have been able to become owners of a club, and then either because the regulations might not be stringent enough, or because the regulations are quite objective rather than subjective, those owners can take control of a club. So yeah, I'd love to talk about that in a bit more detail as well, owners and directors test. Let's see what else we've got in terms of questions. When Liverpool win the league, probably in July or August or beyond, will we be lifting the trophy wearing a night kit? Yeah, it's a great question as well, Joel. So there's going to be a query as to when the season finishes is one thing, but obviously the Liverpool New Balance deal finishes most likely in May or June time, which means effectively that there's a question over whether when that trophy, if it is lifted, which as a Liverpool fan I hope it is as well, whether that will be lifted in a New Balance kit, or whether it will be in a Nike kit, and that will be very particular on the terms of that particular contract. But yeah, it's a great question, and actually that might be something for a bit more of a wider discussion too. Really good question from Federico. Can you recommend a book for an agent to learn more about contract law? Yeah, there's a couple of brilliant books I would recommend. I think one I would say is there's a book that's edited by a great barrister called Nick DeMarco. He's written or rather edited a great book. I contributed as well one of the chapters on EU and competition law, called Football and the Law. And it's a great book. It's a textbook. It's big green front to it. More or less every fantastic sports law practitioner, a number of sports law practitioners have contributed to that, and I'd really recommend having a read of that. And one of the things that I'm going to try and do as I sort of continue on through the week is give some recommendations of particular things as we go along. Oh, got lots of questions coming in at the moment, which is great. So let's just do a few more questions if that's all right, and then I can finish off. So let's go with Andrew Hurwitz. Hey, Andrew, what are you advising players from an employment perspective in light of Corona? Interest in the contrasting approaches we've seen thus far across the continent. Yeah, lots of difficult issues. I mean, I think at the moment the issue is each country will have different employment law contracts and obviously employment laws. So it would be very specific as to each particular country and each particular provisions and clauses. Nonetheless, I think it is difficult for clubs to unilaterally sack and terminate the contracts of players who refuse to take a pay cut and a 50% pay cut, if that's one of the questions. So yeah, I think that's very difficult for the club to do. And I think there will obviously be some cases before FIFA, before CAS at a particular time, and that's, I think, going to be something. The interesting question, which I've done a recent podcast with one of the guys in our team, Alex Harvey, was talking about what happens to players who are out of contract on the 30th of June and whether then the season ultimately doesn't finish by the 30th of June. Will there be a short-term temporary fix? Will they have to sign up to new short-term contracts? Could they actually become free agents at that point? What happens if the new season doesn't start until August, September? Does that mean that they can't effectively play for another club or be employed by another club until that time? All of those type of issues are pretty tricky as well. William Proctor, broadcasting rights. Which clubs own the rights in a match? I assume it's the home team. Is this a matter of IP? Okay, I'm going to leave that for another day, but it's a great question. Ultimately, at the moment, the rights by the Premier League are sold collectively to broadcasters, and the right to access is given by each particular Premier League club to be able to then broadcast those games. But the IP in that, let's leave that for another day, because it can get a little bit complicated. Let's go with a couple more questions, because we're almost up to half an hour, and I don't want obviously everyone to keep waiting for doing anything else with their evening. But Michael, in your book, you mentioned the future of broadcasting via AR following present issues with Corona. Do you think that clubs and broadcasters should move faster towards this direction? Yeah, it's a really interesting one as to why tech can be used in different ways. Look, I think it's likely that at least in the short to medium term, there aren't going to be too many people watching football games together, which is an incredible shame. But I guess the conundrum and the issue for the authorities is to try and work out how those games can still, as safely as possible, can be put on and go ahead, really, for a number of reasons. The broadcasting rights and the money flow, etc., is probably one of the most important. So I don't think AR is coming just yet in terms of what can be done in the short term, but that's obviously a very cool thing that hopefully can be done sooner rather than later too. Let's talk about Asta has asked, I know there is a difference between an agent and a sports lawyer. Can you talk about what you do to always have that difference in mind? So very briefly, when I'm working with agents, what I tend to do is work in collaboration with them. I'm not an agent and I don't want to be an agent, but what I can effectively do is help negotiate the legal terms, the drafting of the particular document. I'm effectively a complementary service. So whilst the agent will be negotiating the commercial terms, the wages, the release clauses, all of that type of commercial issues, when it comes down to then papering that, to be drafting it, to be able to understand what the regulations advise on that, advise on contract law, that's when I usually get involved with lots of different ones of my clients. And then got a few more questions here. Interesting question from Jake. Do you see the English leagues following the French practice of partial unemployment, of deducting a certain percentage from player wages? I think the question there is there going to be percentage deductions in the English leagues? We saw it with Hearts relatively recently, when they asked for a 50% reduction in players' wages, and that was announced relatively recently, I think, or reported on. There's going to be a pinch point at some point. It just depends when that pinch point is, and that's going to be the issue, I think, at the moment. So we'll wait and see on that front. Hopefully, there won't be too many clubs that need to do that. But again, the longer that the season goes on, the higher the risk of gate receipts and commercial deals not coming in, and the broadcasting right monies causing issues. So all of those type of things become quite important. He'll make money back from shirt sales. Is this a myth? Perfect. Yeah, we're going to talk about that in a few weeks. So we'll get on cracking with that sooner rather than later. What I'm just going to do, and thanks everybody for their questions. What I'm going to just try and do for a few minutes now is, just because I know we're getting towards the end, actually we're 29 minutes in, so I don't want to take up your evenings too much more, is just go through a few bits and pieces. So we've had about 10 minutes of Q&A now. I want to just give you a few different resources as well, if possible, as this week and a couple of weeks go on. Because I think when everyone's got a little bit more downtime, one of the things I think it's important for everyone to do is invest in themselves. Everyone's got more time either to watch Netflix or to listen to podcasts or to download content in whichever form it might be, or otherwise. But there's a couple of sources that I think are really, really, really useful. So what the first thing is, I know hopefully Sean Cottrell from Law and Sport might be listening, and I think at some point, one of the things I always say is there's an unbelievable website called lawinsport.com, and it has tons of fantastic articles and tons of brilliant articles on football-related matters. So lawinsport.com is the website. I'd highly recommend you having a look at that website and just investing, even if it's half an hour a day in reading one article. And if you times that by 5 once a week, once every day, 5 a week, that could be 20 to 25 a month. And depending on how long this goes on or otherwise, I think, at times now it's important to try and, invest and improve your knowledge base. Hopefully this course will help to a degree. I would really recommend Law and Sport too. The other thing I would also mention is I'm going to try and give everyone a book recommendation every day. So my recommendation for the day is this book. Hopefully everybody can see it. It's How to Become a Football Agent. So that was a few of the questions that came up today. So this is a book by a great friend, Dr. Erkut Sogut, as well as Charlie and Jack, that have written this book. And it's just a brilliant, practical, insightful guide as to everything you need to know as a beginner to start out in the industry, and as well some really good nuance. So take a look, have a read. I know you can get it on Amazon as well. I've got a few copies as well that I can probably give out over the next couple of weeks on the course as well. But would highly recommend this book, How to Become a Football Agent. It's really well written, really concise, really precise, and I read it probably in about 5 or 6 hours. And then I always look back at particular things in it as well. It's great read and highly recommended. And the other thing, obviously, is I'll be obviously chatting about my book at different times, just from making a reference. This is my book here, Done Deal. Sorry, my hand's in the way. That's my book that's available now. Obviously, what I'm also going to try and do in the next couple of weeks is I've got quite a few copies to be able to give out to people that put questions in, that be able to interact with me. So I'm going to try and give away quite a few books. I've also got quite a lot of Audible codes as well. So I'm going to try and give those out to some people as well over the next couple of weeks too. Lastly, the podcast. So I have a podcast called Done Deal that hopefully people would be interested in. That's Done Deal. If you just go to either Spotify or Apple Podcasts and type in Done Deal, you'll be able to get all of my content. There's loads of stuff there already, probably about 10 or 15 podcasts already on loads and loads of different topics. And lastly, a bit of a shout out as well. At this time when it's pretty difficult for all of us, and everyone looks inwards to make sure that hopefully we're all taken care of. I think it's really important just to be thinking about trying to help the wider community as well. And one of the things that I'm really keen on trying to publicize is a charity that I'm very fond of, that we do I try and do some charity work with and try and donate as possible, called Noah's Ark Children's Hospice. It's a children's hospice in North London, and caters for seriously ill and terminally ill children. And because of the situation we have at the moment, a lot of the funding or guaranteed funding obviously hasn't necessarily arrived because of cancellations of lots of different things. So I would just ask everybody, even if it's just a really small amount, or to raise awareness, or to spread the word, any help you can do in spreading the word for Noah's Ark Children's Hospice. I'll try and do that after each YouTube video, would be much appreciated. So thank you very much for joining me. It's been brilliant to be on, basically. And look, hope I can yeah, see you all guys tomorrow. Please spread the word. We've got football transfers, which will hopefully be a great start to the couple of week course. And thanks for tuning in. See you all tomorrow, hopefully.